Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Up North and Personal, where I speak with Canadian talent and hear their stories. Our guest today, well, I'd say he's a pioneer in the world of comics and sci fi as we know them now. Not only has he rubbed shoulders with some of the brightest minds of our time, he's not too shabby himself. One of the guys behind Canadian classic Prisoners of Gravity, the TV channel Space, and he's spoken to folks from the likes of Stan Lee to the second man on the moon. And even with those lofty feats, ironically, he's super down to earth. I mean, he's speaking to me for goodness sake. So it is an honor to speak today to Master of Multiple Universes himself, Mark Askwith.
Thank you, Malin. You've overblown me. You've
Ah, no.
already overhyped me. Anyway, thank you. That was lovely.
Yeah, yeah. So, it was just like before we even get started, like I have to thank our mutual friend Steve Schneer because when I spoke to him back in like November 2023, before we even started talking, he was like, "You got to speak to Mark Askwith. He will be the coolest guy you ever speak to." So, yeah, I think he was right about that. When I looked up all the stuff, it's like, oh my gosh, Steve was right. He is pretty cool.
Well, actually, I've got to say, the whole Prisoners of Gravity team was cool. Working with the Silver Snail guys, they were cool. And Space team was great too. So it's just been fantastic to work with so many great people on so many things. And I realize over 30 years in media, which is kind of wacky. That's a long time.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And like, I just love just from what I've seen from the stuff that you've done, and like, you have such a passion for just everything that you do, and it's so infectious. It's just a youthful, just starry-eyed kind of thing about it, where it's like this guy, and I just love that about you.
Oh, thank you. I think my passion has carried me a long way. I'm addicted to print, and I really like to interview people, but I like to research so that when I sit down with somebody, they can tell right away. It took me a while to figure that out because I'd come home and I'd go, why does Will Eisner like me? I'm just a guy. Like he has millions of fans. This is ridiculous. And then you'd realize that, people weren't talking to him. And, he was kind of felt like he was in a backwater eddy, interviewing a lot of the astronauts that I've interviewed. I had no idea how political that was when other people interviewed them. And when I interviewed them, it was really about the excitement of exploration. I mean, that's really what I'm interested in is the emotion of these people who do amazing things. So, and their passion. So I think passion connects with passion.
I think so. Yeah, definitely. I think that's why we're here talking today about this stuff because just we just have a passion for it. I was like, I'm so excited. I'm so excited to speak to Mark today.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Steve because his passion for puppets and puppeteering, and again, talking about passion, the thing that kind of relates and connects Steve and me is a passion for storytelling. Even though he's using puppets and I was using documentary or I'm using comics or whatever, my intent was always to tell a story because that's, I think, how human beings connect. And I know Steve is part of that tribe.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. So let's see. So getting to the start of it all. So I wanted to know, like, what was some of the most influential stuff for you in your formative years? Like, how did this all start for you? For anybody who doesn't know.
Well, it's always hard to talk about stuff like that. Now, in my case, I actually remember the first comic that I read, and it was Explorers. It was no Destination Moon
Hmm.
by Ajay. It was a Tintin comic, and I just loved it, and I loved Asterix, and I liked a lot of the European comics that I was reading at the time. And when I was about 6 or 7, I started reading North American comics, and I hated them. They were just awful. They were flimsy. The paper was awful. and I gave up on them. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. That stuff was far more interesting to me when I was, in my single digits. And then when I was about 11 or 12, that's when I kind of discovered, in 1968, I discovered the amazing writers, Harlan Ellison, Ursula K. Le Guin, Chip Delaney, all those writers. And it just, I think that really changed my life. And before that, of course, I'd read the Narnia series and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and all the kind of standard stuff. But one of the things that makes this complicated is that my mother was a children's book seller. And so I grew up in a house of many, many books. And she was really fascinated by the art. So she was really into Arthur Rackham and Edward Gorey, and the list goes on and on and on. And she collected them. So I would have these beautiful Maurice Sendak books. And one of the key ones was In the Night Kitchen, which kind of is a comic. Like, take a look at it and read it like that. And so by 1972, 1973, I kind of got back into comics. And then my love for them was really Steranko and Barry Windsor Smith, Mike Kaluta, Bernie Wrightson. And I've told this to a friend the other day. I said, the only two creators that I hated were Alex Toth and Jack Kirby. And he laughed. I went, you see, I was starting out on my journey. I didn't realize. And that just cracks me up every time I think about it. But that's part of what happened is that 1976, the Silver Snail opened in Toronto. And the group of people that were there, including an amazing collector called George Olszewski, they really educated me. They explained to me why certain comics were important, the history of comics. And I had a sense that North American comics began in 1962. But of course, I learned that was not the case.
Oh, well, that's great. But speaking of the Silver Snail, I know you were the manager there from 1982 to 1987, but what were some of the things that you got up to at the Silver Snail, like fond memories and things like that?
Well, the Silver Snail actually starts out as a comic book store, literally in a closet at back of books. And it doesn't open until May of 1976, which means the 50th anniversary is coming up this year. And I would go in, I wouldn't, talk to anybody. I bought my stuff. At a certain level, the comics were not great. I really liked George Perez. I really liked Howard the Duck. There were a few comics that I really loved. But I would often go to Yonge Street and I would look at the underground comics like Richard Corbin and, the underground comics and learning about them. And then I met a guy at the Silver Snail called Tom Stormont, and he was really into the same stuff I was. And that changed everything because he'd say, oh, well, we've got a whole section of underground comics, which I didn't think a mainstream store could carry. And then he because the Silver Snail had everything, I mean, it was unbelievable. You'd walk into that store and back issues, the first, the showcase with Green Lantern, the very first, Silver Age Green Lantern, Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy 15. This was a comic book store that had everything. And I had no money, which is sad. But I started hanging out there, and so my deal was, Tom taught me, this is when the comics come out. This is the day, new comic book day. And of course, as an early fan, you didn't want to miss out on the latest X-Men or the latest whatever. So I started going regularly to the store. But nothing, it was, that whatever that thing is didn't happen until I went to a comic book convention in Ottawa. called MapleCon. And I'd never really been to a real convention. I'd been to the one-day shows in Toronto,
Hmm.
and I'd met a few people. But the MapleCon blew my mind. To this day, four of the most important people in my life I met at that convention. And one of them was Sven Larson, one of them was Elizabeth Holden, and one of them was Gene Day, whose work I loved, a Canadian comic book artist, and this guy called Frank Miller. And Frank and I really hit it off, and we started corresponding. And we would talk about stories and how story works, and we would. What was great was we didn't just talk about comics. We talked about Hill Street Blues and storytelling, and the limitations and the advantages and what made comic books unique. And those were conversations that I was also having with Elizabeth, who's a letter writer, and Sven, who is a young student. And I don't know what happened. It was just somebody flipped a switch. And Jim Shooter was there, and I basically said, "Look, I want to write comics and I want to get in." And he said, "Oh, you seem like a very smart guy, and I don't think that's what you want to do with your life." Which I go, okay. And then found out, the business history of Marvel and DC, and how close Marvel had come to bankruptcy in the late 70s. And all this stuff was a revelation to me because in 76, the world of comics exploded because of the Silver Snail. So anyway, I had a job. I was working for Coach House Press, making beautiful books. And I had a romantic tragedy in my life. So I went away to Europe for a while. And when I came back, I intended to work back at the Silver Snail, but Frank was pushing me to write comics. And I thought, okay, I'll get a part-time job and then I'll write comics. And the part-time job for about 2 weeks was in the warehouse at the Silver Snail. And almost immediately they said, "Oh, why don't you manage the store?" Which was a dream come true. I just loved that store. And I, you know, it was fine in 1983. And we would bring up a few guests like Paul Smith, who was an artist who worked on the X-Men, and, some local guys and whatever. But I began to realize that my comic book community didn't have access to people who were really making comics. And I thought, well, there's a barrier to entry at conventions. It costs you money to go. It's a special thing. And I thought, well, the Silver Snail, why not do a signing, of whatever, and ramp that up. So every month I thought, we'll do a signing every month and I'll make sure that I can, justify it economically. And what I hadn't really counted on was that the job we were doing at the Silver Snail was creating a buzz in New York and publishing in other places. And then the wonderful artists would come up and they would tell me how great it was, whether or not it was Mike Zeck or any of these wonderful artists. And 1982 is a really interesting, or 1983, that you could feel that something was going on. And Frank Miller was doing great work. Bill Sienkiewicz was coming in. And so that really, it was a really exciting medium. And because the Silver Snail was on Queen Street, which is a very hip street, which is, all kinds of artists, and it was 2 blocks away from the Ontario College of Art, and it was, maybe 12 blocks away from the University of Toronto. But stuff was happening in film. So Denise Cronenberg, David Cronenberg's sister, would come and research costumes at the Silver Snail. And it just, and I would say to people, "Oh, I met this guy. He was really nice." And it turned out to be Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics. Bob Dylan came into the store. Crazy stuff. Just crazy. Like, because the store was building up a certain energy. And people, I get credited for that. The owner should get a lot of credit. But really, the real credit goes to the fans, because the fans, whatever that vibe in that store was, the fans were 80% of that. And of course, when you're selling 2,000 copies of the X-Men, you can afford to bring up Mark Silvestri or Chris Claremont or the people who are creating that book, because you're going, okay, it's going to cost me X number of dollars, but if they have a project coming out, or I have back issues that I have, then I can make this economically feasible. So that's what ended up happening. And then because I was promoting things, I was writing something called the News Line, which was telling people how I felt and what I was doing. Suddenly this feedback happened. And so the Snail became known in North America and in England. In 1982, on my trip, I'd met a couple of guys at a store called Dark They Were and Golden Eyed. And they really impressed me. They really impressed me. And anyway, they ended up opening up their store, which was Forbidden Planet. And then Forbidden Planet was Titan Books. And so the Silver Snail, we had a relationship, which was super fun. And because I like to read, these guys would say, hey, there's a new British author. You should read a guy called Ian M. Banks. You should read it. There's this young guy who's written a short story called Neil Gaiman. You really plugged into the British scene. And of course, in 1982, when I went to, or 1980, sorry, when I went to MapleCon, there was really no Alan Moore, but I'd been reading Warrior magazine. And my two favorite strips in that period total were V for Vendetta and A Marvel Man.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1982, I met Dick Giordano, and he actually had the script, the physical script for Swamp Thing 20, because he was going to give it to Dan Day to draw. And then he said, this is the first issue written by Alan Moore. And I gushed and gushed and gushed. And all of a sudden, you could just tell that Dick Giordano, and we started talking about Len Wein, and we started talking about the character of Swamp Thing. So I was already invested. And then by the time I really was ordering for the store and that issue was coming out, I ordered, I don't know if I can say this on your podcast, but just call it a bleep ton of that particular comic.
For sure.
It didn't sell. It didn't sell. That comic did not sell for a year. And then suddenly it just started, like it was like a switch went, and boom, Swamp Thing went from, not selling a lot of copies to being a really high seller. Mm-hmm. But then I'd talk to other people, other retailers, because I love that. And it wasn't a big book for them. Love and Rockets was huge at the Silver Snail. It was not big in other stores. We had a guy who ran Silver Snail Hamilton, a guy called Stuart Young, and he and I would compare vibes all the time because it was so different. And that's what I love about bookstores, and what I love about comic book stores is the community helps evolve them so that they become very different entities. Part of it based on the guy who's ordering the comics, that would be me, and partly based on the location of the store, and partly based on the fan base. So it's a really interesting alchemical kind of fusion, let me put it that way.
Yeah, I think so. I remember that, what was it? In my neck of the woods, we had a place called Big B Comics, and we got a lot of stuff from... Are you familiar with Big B?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and we got a lot of... That place got a lot of stuff from Silver Snail. And yeah, I was talking to my brother about it just the other day, and he was like, oh, wow, yeah, we got a lot of stuff. Like, he knew the guys who worked there because he goes and gets comics and manga and stuff like that all the time. So he got really friendly and chummy with the guys who ran the store. So it's really crazy how that all just like links together like that.
Well, yeah. And I was only there for 5 years. And I didn't create the store.
Mm-hmm.
That was Ron Van Leeuwen, the owner. Tom Stormoth, who is his right hand man, who later went on. They both went and moved over to Andromeda Distribution, and but so I had a lot of free reign at the store, which I'm very grateful for. But I, it's funny. You look back, and we would do signings with Bill Sienkiewicz, and the first year we did it, it was fine.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 50, 60 people. But by the time 1986 came along, and he was doing Electra with Frank Miller, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people showed up for him, and that was great because at that point he and I had become friends. His work was very divisive in the United States. A lot of store owners that I talked to were really down on his work and didn't get it. It was scratchy, and they didn't like his storytelling. And I loved it, and my customers loved it, which was a good thing.
Oh, of course.
And so that was super fun. Just watching the evolution of comics, and I do think 1986 was the greatest year in comics. Dark Knight comes out, Watchmen comes out, Mouse which had come out in Raw, got packaged up as a book. And a brief sidelight about Mouse. So I'd read it when it was coming out in Raw, and I liked it. I mean, but I liked all of Raw.
Yeah.
But it was fine. It was fine. And I liked it enough that I went back and looked for early versions of it that he'd done in Underground Comics. But anyway, I got the book, and I was taking the bus home. I missed my stop. I was so engrossed by it. I couldn't believe it. And the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. And the sum of its parts were great. But Mouse as a complete emotional, the package, how small it was, the fact that it was in black and white. And as I said, I was a big fan of V for Vendetta. And I liked David Lloyd's art style, which felt like somebody had smuggled it out of a camp. Right, it was very subversive feeling,
Mm-hmm.
and that was true of Mouse. It just felt very intimate and very, just very emotionally present. So yeah, that was great. And Dark Knight, of course, was a huge thing. I was fired. I ordered a whole lot of copies of that book because I had read it because Denny O'Neil had showed it to me when I was in New York. And then the owner of the store said, you've ordered over a third of the copies in Canada. And you've put your friendship with Frank over your loyalty to the store. And he fired me. And the book came out 2 days later. And I said to Tom, what am I going to do? I just got fired. He said, just show up. Because if you're right, that book is going to be hot. And of course, it sold out in North America by Monday. And so all of a sudden, the owner called me up and said, do you have any extra copies? I'm like, they're mine. These are mine. And he was that was really a moment where he realized that the store was really doing something different. We were selling more copies of Yummy Fur by Chester Brown than we were of the Avengers. And again, that's people who went to OCA. That's the community supporting a Toronto creator. So yeah, as I say, it's very much a biofeedback mechanism.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely. There's like so many things I gotta look up after this interview now, like just all these things you're name dropping where it's like, okay, I gotta check this out, I gotta check that out, I want to see this. And I have friends of mine, like when you brought up the name Forbidden Planet, I know you said it was like in Europe, but I know another guy who he does stuff in New York as a voice actor, but he's also a huge comic book nerd, and he was a manager of a store called Forbidden Planet as well. And
oh great, no, well, that's
yeah,
the same store. There
yeah.
were three guys, and one of them decided to go to New York. So what's the name of your friend?
His name is Oliver Wyman, but he also goes by the pseudonym Pete Zarustica, which is based off of I forget. It's like the pseudonym of a superhero, or like the guy who made it, and his favorite food was Pizza Rustica. and that's where he got his pseudonym from. But he's a huge comic book geek, so I hope he listens to this because he's gonna flip when he hears all this stuff.
The Forbidden Planet in New York was wild for me because I had heard about it, and but the first time I went to New York, which was 1986, I ended up having lunch with Diana Schutz, who's a Canadian,
Mm-hmm.
and her boyfriend at the time, who later became her husband, Bob Schreck. And they are lovely people. I mean, they are unbelievably generous and happy and really understood what was going on in the industry. And there are two names you should look up because they were Kamiko. So they were hooked up with Matt Wagner and all these great, you know, title like, and I was selling a lot of that actually. So Matt Wagner did a tour and he came to Toronto. He was in his car and he had copies of his books in the trunk of his car moving around. And he came to Toronto. And of course, I had done the posters, I'd written up a thing. It was a big deal for me. I loved his work. And about 50 copies of his book was sort of what Matt would sell. He was so charismatic and so articulate. We never sold a comic less than 300 copies from then on in, which is,
Very
you know,
nice.
talk about try to justify things. But anyway, we're there, we have lunch. And Diana said, well, I'm really, you know, is it okay? I invited a friend to come to lunch. And I'm like, fine. And it was Chris Claremont, who at the time was the hottest writer in comics. And we finished our lunch. They went off to go to the New York Toy Fair. And Chris said, I'm going to go to Forbidden Planet. And I thought, this has got to be the coolest thing ever. I'm going to go to Forbidden Planet with the writer of the X-Men. That's nuts. And so we went and it was hilarious. And he bought his own book off the rack. Actually, he was surprised that I knew what books were coming out that week because, of course, I was a retailer. So, of course, I knew. And so we picked it up and we talked about that. And I said, well, what about comps? Like, you're a writer of like, you should be getting comp copies. And he said, yeah, but they often take, you know, weeks to get to me. And this is a guy who lived in New York and was visiting the offices regularly. So I thought, man, could you imagine if you lived, well, in Canada or, you know, in Britain, you know, and you're going to need those. I think you really need the physical thing so that if you're writing, you know, 6 or 7 issues ahead, you can constantly have a sense of this is what my book is doing.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Makes sense to me.
that's a digression, but there we go.
That's okay. That's what I like to do here. I just like to let, you know, my guests I just like to turn them loose. I just set them up and then I just let them go and just, who knows where it's going to go, but it's always interesting.
Hello down there on Earth. This is Commander Rick up in space. I'm on board a communications satellite. I'm a prisoner of weightlessness up here, and you're a prisoner of gravity down there. How did I get up here? Well, a couple of years ago I was living down on Earth, and then Nancy, roll a clip.
On to another question I got. So again, talking about Steve again, he told me to check out Prisoners of Gravity, and I love it so much. It is such a great show in that it feels like there are so many times where it's like I'm saying to myself, like, we've come a long way since like 89, 94, and in other ways it's like, oh wow, things haven't changed a bit in like a lot of good ways, and very forward thinking in a lot of ways. And it's just a fascinating, like what you said earlier, like about the human, it's very human, and I really like that about that show. And I would recommend it to anybody who loves comic books and stuff, because I know a few people who out there who may have never even heard of it, and it might be their favorite show ever if they just saw it, because, you know, it was on like TVO and maybe a couple of PBS stations here and there. But I know people who weren't close to, like, who aren't in Ontario or had a PBS station that would pick it up, and I know that this would be their jam. But it's just a great show.
Thank you. It was a labor of love, and we made 137 episodes, and I don't know how many interviews I did, probably in excess of 500.
Yeah, it says
And
somewhere like 400, 500 from other things I've seen.
I wouldn't even know. And what's wild is I thought of it as a very ephemeral thing. I did my best. I wanted the shows to be great, and but I thought they'll go to air, they'll be rerun in the summer, and that will be it. No one will ever see this show again. But I wanted to make them themed in such a way that if they ever did decide to rerun the episodes, you could have an episode called Fairy Tales, which would be really about fairy tales in literature, and discuss them in a certain way that was going to be evergreen. It was going to be timeless. What I hadn't known about or counted on was YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, people that I didn't even know, like Ted Dog 3000,
Yeah,
started posting Prisoners of Gravity. And people like Steve and other friends of mine would call me up and go, "Oh my God, your show is on YouTube." I'm like, "What?" It just never occurred to me. And I'm like, "How did they get them?" And he said, "Well, but there were a lot of people in Ontario and a lot of people in Detroit.
Yeah.
We had a huge fan base in Detroit. The first letter I ever got, and I only got 3 letters in 5 years at Prisoners of Gravity, but the very first one we got was from a woman called Pat York, and she thought she nailed the show. And one of the things she said was, "I tape every episode so I can go back, and I also like to make the list of everything that your show talks about. So if you mention a book or a new author, then I'm able to follow up on it." And I thought, "I love you, Pat York." And I wrote her back and I just said, "This is the greatest letter I've ever gotten. This is exactly what I hoped would happen, was that this show would be a gateway to people and open it up." And I also wanted to get rid of the idea of the delivery mechanism being the thing we talked about. So comic book people would talk about comics, and movie people would talk about movie, and novelists would talk about maybe talk about fiction. I'm like, mix it all together, because they're all bouncing off each other.
Mm-hmm.
TV, film, comics. And that I didn't know that was a radical idea, but it was pointed out by a number of people to me that at that time that was quite a radical idea. And then we also had hyperlinks. So an author would come on, it would be, maybe they made a reference to Ray Bradbury, and then we'd explain who Ray Bradbury was. And that became very close to an early version of hypertext, and some of that stuff. And of course, because William Gibson is a Canadian, we did early shows on cyberpunk and a lot of shows about technology, and that kind of stuff. We did a show on cyberpunk, and at the end of the interview with William Gibson, he looked at me and he said, "I've just been on a North American tour. I've been interviewed hundreds of times. You were the only interviewer who never used the word cyberpunk." And I went, "Because it's a label, and I don't like the labels. I don't like it when someone says this is feminist or this is Democrat, this is Republican." I get rid of all that, because those things, at a certain level, they become meaningless. You go, these are almost catchwords, and they don't work for me. They don't work. So I'd rather, let's talk about body modification. Let's talk about what it is to be human. And that almost every show came back to that. These are handmade shows about, that basically say a human being made this. If you had to sum up Prisoners of Gravity in one sentence, it would be a human being made this. And that was the show. That was Rick Green. That was every author that we interviewed. And it has that feel. And people were like, you're smart enough to know this, but I did the interviews, and then Rick Green was the host, but it always looked like they were being interviewed by him, which really relieved a lot of pressure for me, because I didn't want any notoriety, and I wanted to be able to walk into a convention and not be known and get my interviews with whoever I wanted. And Rick would be the one who would be red meat, where everybody would want to talk to him. And I'm like, that's great. He likes that. There's an extrovert quality to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not that way. So people have often said, why didn't you host the show? I'm like, because I would have lasted 2 months and then I just would have given up. So much happier, being behind the scenes and working with hosts. It's one of the favorite parts of my job in television was working with hosts. Unbelievable. They're
sure.
great people.
Oh, for sure. And it's like, because I knew Rick Green from the Red Green Show, and it was always funny because his character didn't speak. So when I actually heard him speak in The Prisoners of Gravity, I was like, oh my gosh, he has a voice. It's Bill.
I'll tell you one thing so one of the backstories about Rick and I is that we played ball hockey together every week for a long time. And I met him because he was part of a comedy troupe called The Frantics. And I just adored those guys. They're really great. And, but we needed a host. It ended up being Rick. And I kind of think about the moment you put somebody, this is a digression, but the moment somebody becomes the center of something, it kind of shifts the axis. And at the beginning of the show, people hated the fact that this guy was a cartoon character. And not, you've seen the show, so you know that it's not that. But people would see the images and just go, well, I'm not going to watch that show. And that fascinating. Like, I don't, it took me a long time to realize how to best use Rick. And I don't think we figured that out until the third year. And it was like, okay, now I know how to weave him in. And so I would do interviews with people and I would say, I'm going to ask you questions that our host would ask. And so my name is Rick. Of course, they would know it wasn't. But I'd say, he's going to ask you some strange questions that a normal interviewer would not. And they're like, okay. So we interviewed Charles Vess about winning the Hugo Award for a Sandman issue. And he talked about the game and he talked about the award. And he said, and then afterwards I went and played ping pong with so-and-so. And of course, Rick's reaction was, and we aired it, was, well, who won? Who won the ping pong game? Only Rick would, in the middle of asking somebody about a Hugo Award, would suddenly go, well, who won the ping pong game? But yeah. So that triggers another, I've got to tell you this story.
Oh, yeah.
So people often ask me, what's the best interview, blah, 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 who is the best person? That stuff is really tough because it's so hard and there were so many. But one of the most memorable to me was the first time that I interviewed Douglas Noel Adams. Now, Douglas Adams wrote one of my favorite books of all time, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he was there to promote a book called Last Chance to See, which is non-fiction-ish and is an ecological book. And the publicist reached out and they said, look, we want you to do this. But we want you to focus on Last Chance to See. So I, of course, and they very graciously gave me an hour. And I went, whoa, an hour? Like that's a long time because most of my interviews are about half an hour. So I thought about it and I went, okay, all right. So I went to the cameraman and I went to our director and I said, I have an idea and I want to run it past everybody so that it will work technically. And I need you to know what I'm doing. And so I had to bring in Rick and I said, I'm going to tell you all what I'm doing. So the first half of the interview was all about science and ecology, all kinds of stuff, and very straight, completely straight. And then about 24 minutes in, which is how long the tapes were at the time, we switched the tape and I moved from one chair to another, which was shot in a different way, because my idea was that Rick Green would interrupt an interview that Enrico Gruen, who was the fake host of Second Nature, and so Rick would be interrupting this because he wanted to talk to Douglas Adams. And at the end of the interview, which was, that half was all about comedy. It was about, science fiction. It was a really different interview. And at the end of it, Douglas Adams came to me and said, "That was the most schizophrenic interview I've ever done." And he gave me his card, which was amazing. So I had Douglas Adams' card. So when we packaged the show, I sent it to him. And, that's it. That's lovely. And then sometime later, like 2 years later, I was at a literary festival and I was going to interview him. And he picked up our conversation as if it was like no time had passed. So I think he had a photographic memory. And again, so all of a sudden, you're driving around Toronto in a big limousine while he's talking to his agent on the phone about the Hitchhiker's film, and you're thinking, this is not normal. What am I doing? And so those become the really memorable things where something just totally weird happens. And again, it's passion connecting with passion. I think he knew that I was a straightforward fan. I wasn't going to suck out his oxygen, and that I had I really wanted to know and interact with him. And of course, my feeling about Douglas Adams is he was a good writer, but he was a brilliant conversationalist, one of the greatest conversationalists I've ever met, full of insight. And you'd sit there and I'd go, "Why am I not filming this? This is amazing." So, well, I'll tell you another story about him.
For sure.
So in the interview, the first interview I did with him, Enrico Gruen asks him, "So how would you define what a computer is?" And so he has this great answer about how, we thought at the beginning, we thought it was a computational device. We thought it was about math. And then we realized with a long feature list. And then we thought, oh no, it's a typewriter with a long feature list. And now we know that it models information. And he said, and then Enrico says, "Well, what do you see as the future of computers?" And he said, "Well, they'll become invisible. They'll probably be woven into my shirt. And the day I get it, I'll spill red wine on it." I just thought, that's Douglas Adams. That's a guy. That's a really smart guy. The guy who ran BACA was a friend of mine called John Rose. And I used to go there every week and buy my science fiction. And I remember saying to him, "I'm going to interview Douglas Adams. And I know you've met him and I know you've seen him. What advice would you have, for me to interview Douglas Adams?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, he's 6 inches taller than you and 60 IQ points smarter." Oh, yes, I'm very fond of Douglas Adams.
I still need, I should probably read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but my mom always goes on about how she read that when she was growing up. So when she hears this, she's going to freak.
Well, yeah, anytime you meet somebody who creates something that you really connect with, there's something, you're giving them respect and you're responding to a piece of work, which is, nobody knew that I did Prisoners of Gravity, so nobody said anything. really. And Rick Green would every once in a while tell me. But it wasn't until the 25th anniversary, we were at a panel about the 25th anniversary of Prisoners of Gravity. And it was so moving for me because people would get up and say, I grew up with the show and now I'm a writer or now I'm an artist. And, you were the people who proved to me that a Canadian could actually, write science fiction. And of course, at the time, the science fiction scene in Toronto was exploding with Robert J. Sawyer and Tanya Huff and these amazing writers, Andrew Weiner. Like, a lot of really interesting stuff was happening in Toronto, which was great because I had no budget on Prisoners of Gravity. So that if I could interview somebody who lived down the street, that would save me time and money.
That's kind of what I'm
we
doing.
Well, yeah. And there's like, I didn't know it at the time, but because you think you're doing one thing and then you look later and you go, oh, I really covered the Canadian scene at the time, which was not what I was consciously thinking. It just happened to be a really interesting side effect.
Oh yeah, for sure. And yeah, speaking about the budget, I know the budget for Prisoners was about like $23,000 per episode. So, but I was curious, like, how was that budget like split between what you guys did?
Well, a lot of that money is salaries. So the team was, if in say season 2 or season 3, myself, Greg Thirlbeck, who was the director and often produced, Rick Green, who was the host and wrote almost all the episodes. Greg and I structured the episodes. And then Shirley Brady, who came in at the end of season 1, was the person that did everything. You need somebody in the office who will just pick up the slack. So she did research, she did outreach. I don't think we could have done the show without any member of that team. And it was very harmonious. You mentioned the Red Green show. One of the things that's fascinating about Prisoners of Gravity, from my perspective, is that Rick Green was working on 3 shows at the same time. Red Green, where he was essentially all physical and no talk. Prisoners of Gravity, which was all talk and virtually no physical. And then he was also doing History Bites. I mean, that's like unbelievable that the guy could do 3 and shows at the same time. And it did affect us. I mean, that sounds like a negative, but he would come in one day a week and look at the material that Greg and I had shaped. And then we would say, this is what's going on. And then I would say, we need a bridge to go from Ray Bradbury to Harlan Ellison talking about Mars. And of course, he's watched the clips, so he knows what it is. So Rick, being Rick, would write 5 jokes for every little thing. And he'd just test them out and see which one worked best, which, again, amazing. And then every second week, we would record 2 episodes on a Friday. And on Thursday, Greg and I would do the, structuring. So I would have figured out what was going to be in the show and what I would call baggy. So I would have 40 minutes for what was going to be a 27.5-minute show, because I knew that my brain and Greg's brain would want to make everything streamlined and not have any digression, as I'm doing now, because you asked me about budget. So we had $400,000 for 30 episodes a year, which is not a lot of money. So most of it was salary. And then we went to 2 conventions a year. So we had to choose very, very, very carefully what those 2 conventions would be. We took a lot of flack because people would say, hey, how come you don't come to the Niagara Falls convention? How come you don't come to Vancouver? And I'm like, I would love to, but we can't afford. And the one big splurge was in season 3, just because of the way things worked out and because of my relationship with the Titan Books people. We went to England, and that's where we interviewed Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons and Michael Moorcock, Brian Aldiss, and tons of other people. And that really changed the show, because the Brits were really, really articulate. They'd been through this before. Almost all of them had been interviewed. And they were all new to the North American market. I don't think anybody had seen Alan Moore and what he looked like. And so that was really, and Dave McKean, but I knew Dave because he did a signing at the Silver Snail with Grant Morrison for Arkham Asylum. Yeah, so it's all, where did the money go? Mostly to very low paychecks. And well, because you can figure it out, you can do the math, and to conventions, and that, plus we had to pay for our editor, Brian Karn. We had to pay for the cameraman. And then we had studio time. So one of the brilliant things that Greg Thurlbeck did was not shoot every Friday. He said, I can do 2 shows every second Friday. And that had a huge impact on the budget, as you can imagine. And so we became a lot more streamlined and a lot more economical, which was great, because then that freed up Rick. I think a lot. I think it took a lot of pressure off of Rick, and that a lot of my job and Greg's job was to remove as much pressure as possible from Rick, because I think hosts work best when they're really, really free, and you feel, what you focus on is the energy, not the delivery. And I would always say to Rick, the content is important, but what really matters is how you're selling it, how you're enthused about it. And one of my favorite examples of that is the Watchmen episode, which is just Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons back and forth. And I did those interviews in England. And when you watch Rick Green, you like, oh my God, like he loves the Watchmen. And at that point, I read it. Yeah, didn't read the backup, but I read it. And I'm like, Rick, I have read that book 50 times and I have read everything. And that was always really fun. And I also, with that, I would put stuff in, and it was always really interesting to get Rick's feedback about where we were going. At the end of every year, because we were so busy, we couldn't really have meetings all the time. We'd have a story meeting, and then that would be it. But at the end of each season, I would talk to Rick and talk to Greg and talk to Shirley and say, okay, we're going into another year. We got to do all the interviews, or as many as possible, between now and September. What are the topics? What are the things that we think are going to be hot button issues? What do we think is going to be really interesting based on the people that we've got? So it's a chicken and egg. But so Shirley would say, hey, if we go to Boston for the Nebula Awards, or New York for the Nebulas, actually, if we go, we can get Isaac Asimov. We can get so-and-so and so-and-so and Dan Simmons. And, the list would grow. And then it would be great, because Greg Thurlbeck, who is a reader and passionate about certain people, would say, I want to do these 5 authors, or I want to interview them. And I'd say, okay, well, I'll interview these 5 authors who I think are great. And then I'd say, okay, then we're starting to develop what the season is going to be. So who else do we need to interview, to fill that out? But boy, and we, of course, in the course of this, you make, you make connections with people. And so you'd interview someone and they'd say, oh, well, if you're doing a show on fairy tales, then you really need to interview so-and-so. And then you'd see, okay, how is it possible? And in some of our cases, we would be, talking to a convention, and they would say, who would you like us to bring up? we have a choice between these three authors. Or they would say to me, hey, you're friends with so and so. Can you get them to come to the convention? And I go, well, that's perfect because that'll save me money.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really about one of the things that defined the show, other than the team, was our lack of resources. So we had to constantly be creative and figure out how we were going to use what we had to make the show.
For sure, yeah, and I really love that about like I always love hearing stories about how people like they don't have like all the money in the world, but when you watch the thing or you, in my case, like if I play a game or something and I see that and I hear like it didn't have much of a budget, I really don't think about that because it's still at the end of the day, it's still like really entertaining, and I'm not really thinking about like, oh, how much money is being used here. So like I say, you guys did a great job with what you had, and yeah.
It's and really, it's the kindness of strangers. I mean, the Merrill collection were helping us. The people at Bacco were helping us. The people at Silver Snail were helping, and it really, yeah. And I said this on panels. This show doesn't happen without Daniel Richler, who is the head of arts at TV Ontario, and with the Toronto community.
Mm-hmm.
They gave us a lot of feedback. The first year was very negative. People hated the show, and that was very difficult to deal with. But if you listen, and people will tell you what they want, and you're able to incorporate that if it's driven by passion. Like I wanted the show to be great. I wanted the show to be celebrating, comics and science fiction and fantasy and science. I wanted to celebrate all that. And, even though you get setbacks, you have a vision, like this is what we're going to do. And that was, and people have said to me, well, you said the show doesn't get good until season 3. And my attitude is television is hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard. Your podcast is hard. And so the actual interview may be 10% of the work that you put into it because you're researching, you're setting it up technically, you're doing all that kind of stuff. At least on Zoom, you're able, you've taken away a lot of the complexity of me having to get a cameraman and a sound guy and, a location, and flying there or whatever, driving.
Yeah. For sure. I also wanted to ask because I always loved how when the transition into Prisoners of Gravity from Second Nature, but is the banjo music for Second Nature an original piece or is it like stock music? I'm just curious about that.
Okay, I'm going to kind of change the question, but the main music for Prisoners of Gravity is Norman Ornstein. And that was music that he did. And in season 1, it was baggy. It was good, but it was like, a little loose. And when Greg and I were talking about the opening of the show, Greg said, I want to recut the opening and I want the music to be different. And I thought, well, we can't really change the music. And Greg said, yeah, but we can add instruments. So we went to Norman and said, part of what's going to be different about this show is it will be, we hope, international. We're hoping that we'll be able to do something like that. And so Norman put in instruments and instrumentation that felt world music, really, So that was part 1. And so Greg Thurlbeck and I were huge fans of a show called Twin Peaks. And so we thought, and Greg had in my original pitch, I had said, that Commander Rick was a digital pirate and that he was living in this satellite and that he was interrupting the TVO signal. And when Greg came in as the director for season 2, 3 and 4 and 5, he said, you abandoned that idea. I said, well, the director didn't get it. And so that wasn't incorporated. And he said, it's a great idea. So he worked with Brian Karn, and these guys figured out what they were going to do in terms of an opening. I had nothing to do with it. And I came down into the edit suite and they said, look, and the music was that music, and you're very perceptive. It was stock music. It was the kind of music that TVO played all the time on various of its shows. And that's part of the joke, was that it was going to feel like, that kind of a show. And then Rick took, figured out what we were doing, or really what Brian and Greg had done, and went, okay, then I know who the character is that would host that show. It's on Rico Gruen, which he thought was funny, and we all thought was funny because it was like Rick Green, but not. And we thought people would get into the joke. And then we did it for 4 or 5 shows. And the audience told us, oh, what happened to your show? Prisoners of Gravity wasn't on. I'm like, what do you mean? So we realized that Second Nature could only be on for about 10 or 15 seconds and then be interrupted. Because if we went too long, or if there was some sort of, because we liked the idea of having a joke or having Enrico Gruen introduce the show in a certain way, you're like, we have to get to Prisoners of Gravity as soon as humanly possible. And then the other genius thing was Greg went, okay, well, then we need to come back to TVO. And we're like, that's brilliant. And he goes, and here's the thing, that Rick Green, or, in Commander Rick, wouldn't have credits on his show, right? It wouldn't, because he's in a satellite. So the credits of the show are for Second Nature, which is us, which is the team. I just thought, oh, Greg, you're a genius. That is a brilliant idea. And it still holds up. It's still pretty funny.
I'm losing you. Oh, you hijack a signal and they hijack it right back again. There's no such thing as a free launch. Darn, and we didn't get to talk about movies and TV shows that have been adapted into computer games, or short stories that have been adapted into full-length novels. Nancy, quickly, are there any other... Next week on Second Nature, scientists say we may be able to use technology, heavy industry, and large machines to turn Mars into a planet like Earth. Hopefully before we turn Earth into a planet like Mars.
Yeah, and it did allow us to get credits, which was, you have to have, because unions and vanity. So that was great. And, and again, you can see how it's so hard. We don't have money. We can't afford new music. So we're going to use canned music. If we're going to use canned music, then that's going to feel like a Canadian heritage thing. Then how do we take advantage of that? Oh, well, we've got to have, loons flying, or we've got to do, this, your heritage moment, or something quintessentially Canadian. And as I say, all of that was Greg and Brian Karn. And I think it changes the show, because the moment you do that, you're saying something, which was, as I say, in my original proposal, because I wanted the idea of subversion. I wanted the idea that this was not normal, that we had to interrupt things, because no one was talking about comics and science fiction and fantasy in 1989 or 1990. It just, there was no show that was doing it. Not in the States, not in Britain, and not here.
That's amazing. Yeah. It's just, I love seeing it just because, like you said, it still works today, because you can imagine like someone recorded this off of VHS and then something got interrupted in the feed, but then it kind of like, not wakes me up, but it's like, oh, okay, signal's done, show's over, okay, we're getting back to reality now. And it's like, oh, okay, now it's just a great feeling. And I just love the music, and I was like, I hope it's stock so I can like track it down and then maybe use it somewhere, because I just like how it sounds. I hear that a lot. It is
stock. Yeah, it is stock, and partly because the opening was relatively short. The end credits are where the music is really getting played and getting exposure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So if you're going to Shazam it,
Yep,
Shazam
yep,
the credits.
yep. If you can believe it, I've only started using Shazam in the last couple years, and I'm like, this is amazing. I would find like music from like bumpers from like when I was watching TV, and it would have like a really soothing song for like the following program contains blah 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 blah, and it's like, what is that music? And then I find it like 15 years later. It's like, wow. But one other question about Prisoners of Gravity. Where did Nancy come from, and did you ever imagine what she would sound like if she had a voice? Has that ever crossed any of you guys' minds?
Yes. How does Nancy come up? Well, because we wanted to do hypertext, or what we now call hypertext, we wanted to. I had a problem as structuring the show, because I would say this author mentions a book, and go, oh, I love the movie Charlie, and you'd want to go, okay, well, we really, for the purposes of this show, need to explain that Charlie was based on Flowers for Algernon, by by whoever it was, or whatever the year was. So we started, Greg and I really started thinking about, okay, how do we deliver that information? And so it just became very straightforward. We'll just get a black bar, we'll put a computer type text, and I'll, in the script, because I'm writing Rick Green does this, then in the script we could also have, this is the Chiron, what we call Chiron, but this is going to explain who Ray Bradbury is, or what the name of this story is, or whatever. So that was the extent of my input. And again, Brian and Greg, I go into the edit bay, they're like, okay, let's watch the show. And they've created this character of Nancy, the Cybernetic 3000. Why? Because Nancy sounded like a fun name, and that would work with Rick Green. And it just seemed perfect. So we all laughed. We all thought it was great. Shirley liked it. And I think Shirley and I were the designated laughers on the show. We were the people who would laugh the most. Mm-hmm. And we laughed. And so, of course, that then they're going to keep it in, or we're going to keep it in. And Rick started playing with it. So we ended up doing one episode. We were getting so much praise for Nancy. And we would go to literary festivals, and people would say, oh, my God, I love Nancy. And have you thought about what Nancy is? And so I was working on a show called Robots. And the show was largely going to be about Isaac Asimov and, the rules of robotics and all those kind of 1950s robot-y things. And I mentioned it to Cory Doctorow, who I tried to hire to be on the show. And he was a kid. I think he was 16. He was very young. And he said, oh, that's stupid. That's stupid. You should do half the show about robots and then half the show about artificial intelligence. And I was like, yeah, but there's nobody I can really talk to about AI. I don't really, I don't know, maybe I'm not reading the right books or whatever. And he goes, here's a bunch of books you should read. And so I did. So we ended up deciding to do that show. And someone, and I don't know who, said, oh my God, why doesn't Rick say, I want to do a show on robots? And then Nancy takes it over and makes it a show about artificial intelligence. So we'll be able to go back and forth between the two. And I don't think it was my idea, but it certainly, I had the material, and I went, okay, we can do that. That'll be great. So then we really started talking about Nancy and her personality and what she was doing and the idea of an AI. And here's a secret. So at the end of season 5, Rick Green and I had a talk, and he said, I can't I'm overwhelmed. I've got 3 shows, and I have to give up one show. And I'm going to give up Prisoners of Gravity. And I'm like, dude, this is great. You defined the show. And he goes, well, I'm afraid that if I leave, the show will be canceled. And I said, well, I don't, we're doing really well. The ratings are great. So let's talk about what we can do. And we decided we were going to hire a female actor to play Nancy. So the final episode of season 5 was going to be Rick in his basement, and the camera would go up and you'd see the 2 feet, and the woman would say, Rick, come up for dinner, and we all thought that was hilarious. But as it turned out, Prisoners of Gravity was canceled. In February, we found out that the show was going to go away, and it had nothing to do with Rick going, by the way. So it was heartbreaking, but I decided, well, then we can't do that because that would undercut the show. And so we didn't do that. But yes, we had thought about Nancy. We even had someone that we were pretty sure we were going to hire.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, if you can find that episode, Robots AI, that's probably the best Nancy Rick thing. And then, because we all loved Nancy, we kept trying to work her into the show more and more, which is, again, fun. Yeah, again, you don't have a lot to work with, so you've got to be as creative as possible. And that, I think it added another texture to the show.
I think so too. Yeah, definitely. I always hear limitation breeds creativity, and yeah, that's a shining example of that. I love that about the show.
Yeah, if we'd had a big budget, maybe we would have had a second actor or voice actor at the very least.
Yeah.
But we couldn't afford any of them. Yeah. And I think because it was such a small team, that it allowed a certain specificity and a certain unity of vision. Everybody was on board. Everybody knew what the show was. Everybody knew what their role was. Everybody knew that they didn't have to stay in their lane. Shirley started doing interviews, and she did, I think, one of the best interviews we ever did on Prisoners of Gravity. She got an interview with Ray Bradbury. And I remember her, we set it up, and then she came to me and she said, well, we're having a meeting again. Well, who's going to do the Ray Bradbury interview? And I was like, it should be you. And she's like, well, it can't be me. It was Ray Bradbury. I'm like, no, you're the perfect person. I just didn't want it to go down a rabbit hole, which it would have gone with me. I knew it would have been a disaster with Rick or Greg. Like, we'd just be too kind of, it's Ray Bradbury. And she wouldn't, she had a certain, he didn't mean, he wasn't David Bowie to her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And she did, it was a brilliant interview. And I remember getting it back, and she was disappointed. She thought she'd done a terrible job. And I started watching it, and I said, this is brilliant. Because what she did, we came together, and she said, well, what should you do? And I said, well, look, here's the thing. I'm not going to tell you how to do the interview. But coming up in the next season, we're going to do a show on Mars. We're going to do a show on memory. We're going to do, these are the shows we're going to do. So why don't you go and research and then pick 2 or 3 shows you think Ray Bradbury should go into and focus on those 2 or 3 themes. And because if you put Ray Bradbury on TV, people are going to want him to say more than a 17-second soundbite, which is often what we did, right? You suddenly go, oh, I've got so-and-so on tape. Here's Harlan Ellison for 25 seconds. And I knew if we did that with Ray Bradbury, we would piss off a lot of people. So I thought, no, do it this way. And because of that interview, it changed the way I suddenly went to Greg and I went, we really need to do what she did. Because, you're going to go interview Connie Willis, talk about 3 things: time travel, writing and advice, just break it down. So we weren't rushing after somebody like it was described by one person that I interviewed saying, it felt like I was chasing them and they were on the bus. Like because
Yeah.
I was doing that. I was doing that because I was trying to fill up. Okay, I'm going to need 10 people for this show or whatever. But we did the Ray Bradbury show, and then that's when I went, okay, we can do a show like Watchmen, which is literally just two people. And that show, I was so scared about that show. I really didn't think it was going to work. I really didn't think it was going to work. So I patterned it with all kinds of, Archie Goodwin and Neil Gaiman, and, several writers, and Harlan Ellison, and like there were a lot of people talking about Watchmen, and I was showing it, like a rough cut to Greg, and he just said, "No, we don't need any of that. It should just be them." I'm like, "Are you sure?" Because that's crazy. Like we had never done anything like that, and Rick Green was really the one who said, "Come on, you're always trying to be subversive. You're always trying to try something new. What's stopping you?" Right? I thought, yeah, you're right. Yes, I should have real confidence in my interview. I should have real confidence in Alan and Dave, and we put it together. And I think it's one of the best shows we did. And it's on YouTube, the Watchmen show.
Yeah, I saw
And
it. Like, I haven't even read
yeah,
Watchmen, but I watched that episode and I was like, this is really good. I just like what they're talking about and their viewpoints on things like, again, like when he mentioned like a proscenium arch, and then I saw the little info bit. I was like, oh, I like that. Thank you. I didn't know what a proscenium arch was until I read that. And now that's like one of the things I'm going to look back on because I love drawing and art and stuff like that. And I'm just going to think about that when it comes to like when he was talking about like like it's not the panel that's the most important part, it's what's going on in the panel that everyone's going to take away from that. And I'm like, that's so cool.
one of my favorite moments was I went to the Silver Snail after that show had gone to air. And I was just walking in to buy my comics. And there were two people, and they were looking at the graphic novel of The Watchmen. And this guy was saying to his friend, "Look, it's a mirror. The whole chapter is echoed into, it's a mirror, and it's like," and I went, "Oh, that's hilarious," because that's from my show. And then the one that got all kinds of people talking was the cover of the third issue, where it's a skull, and I think it's Dave Gibbons who talks about that cover, and it says "All Out Helter," and uh, and I suddenly realized, wow, my show was having an impact because it's making people think about comics in a different way, and it's making people realize there's more to something than what's on the surface. Like these guys were doing something really different.
Rorschach's Journal, October the 12th, 1985. Dog carcass in alley this morning. Tire tread on burst stomach. This city is afraid of me. I have seen its true face. The streets are extended gutters, and the gutters are full of blood, and when the drains finally scab over, all the vermin will drown. The accumulated filth of all their sex and murder will foam up about their waist, and all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us." And I'll look down and whisper, "No."
At the end of my interview with Alan, and that was one of the longest interviews I've ever did. I did a 5-hour interview with Douglas Adams, and I did a 2.5-hour interview with Alan. But at the end of it, I got him to read from Watchmen. So he read, that wonderful passage that opens the first episode. And I sent a copy of the tape to Alan and a copy of the tape to Dave. And I got a phone call from Dave who said, "Mark, I just started watching your show and I'm appalled. I'm distressed because Alan and I had discussed the fact that he would never read Watchmen in that way, out of context and not part of my work." And I was crushed. I was completely crushed. I can't tell you. I was literally weeping. And then as the day went on, I thought, I can't let this linger. So it was about 2 or 3 o'clock my time. So about 7 or 8 his time. I thought, screw it. I'm calling Dave Gibbons. And I called him up and I just was bracing for him to, be mad at me and explain it. And Mark, I just watched the show. And I've got to say, although I didn't have a stopwatch, I noticed I got more time than Alan. And I went, okay, there we go. And we had a great talk about that. And because at that time, he said, everybody talks about Watchmen as if it's an Alan Moore joint. It's all Alan Moore. And, if Pog did anything, it showed people what Steve Bissett did on Swamp Thing. It showed that comics are a collaboration between the writer and the artist. Now, sometimes it's a cartoonist and they do both, but often, and a lot of the stuff we covered. Did you see the show on Sandman?
I have not yet.
Okay, because that's Neil Gaiman, his editor is in it, and then a lot of the artists. So the artists are able to talk about working on a project. And what became fascinating to me is that Neil wrote scripts differently for every single artist. So it was a really interesting thing. So he'd talk about working with P. Craig Russell on Sandman 50, and that was written as a prose story. Because one of the great strengths of P. Craig Russell is that he could break a story down in that way. So that again, it looks like it's an episode about Sandman, and it is, but it's also showing how collaboration works, which is another one of I think we did something like 5 or 6 shows that really were about collaboration. They were they were disguised as other topics, but they really were about collaboration. So Watchmen is that, Sandman is that, a bunch of other ones.
That's really cool. And that kind of leans into another question I had, because I know you modded for Stan Lee at Fan Expo 2010, and I looked up some recordings of it, and you asked him about collaboration and how he loves to collaborate, and he just comes back saying, I don't love to collaborate. I'm not an artist. I have to collaborate. If I could draw like them, you never even hear of those artists. I just thought that was really funny.
Oh, that was a fun, he and I at that point had done a lot of interviews together. But on that day, he just seemed a bit down. He just seemed tired. And I don't blame him. I mean, the guy was unbelievable in terms of his workload. And he was, in his 80s.
Yeah,
he may have been even older than that. I can't remember.
87 or something around
something
that time.
like that, yeah. So I said to him, look, Stan, if, one of the things that you can and should do is that a lot of people in the audience know me, they know my way, and so make fun of me, make fun of my question, make fun of my pomposity. And I could just see in his eyes, he just lit up. But he didn't attack me, but something like what you just mentioned meant it could free him up to be funny in that way.
I shouldn't have to do all the work. You're the interlocutor. Wait a minute, are you doing it without a mic, or do you have one of those mysterious things pinned to you? Yes, sir. Oh, sure, I have to hold this here.
You're credited with coming up with this new way of writing comics in the mid-'60s. Tell me about the Marvel method and why you employed it.
You are good. You remember all these questions, too, without even looking at your notes. I wish I could do that.
Again, that's a real trick. When I teach interviewing, I always say to people, your interview begins the moment you meet them, right? Our interview began with a short pre-introduction, but you're setting a tone. Mm-hmm. You are telling me who you are, and then I'm able to respond in that way.
Absolutely.
And still be true to myself.
Yeah.
I mean, Stan was 100% Stan in that interview.
Mm-hmm. I can tell.
Yeah. But I was, it always fascinates me particularly again with collaboration, how much did he bring to the table? How much did the artists bring to the table? And that's a complicated question, particularly with Stan Lee, because you really get a sense that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and others really drove the story. Gene Colan, you knew Gene was driving Daredevil. You knew Jack Kirby was driving the Fantastic Four. Same thing with Ditko and with John Romita Sr. So, yeah, I always was interested in that. And of course, he became the symbol of Marvel, which kind of changes the audience's perception of him. And of course, he did all those cameos in all those Marvel movies.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Now let's see.
What time are we at?
Oh, we are at 12:24. How are you on time?
Okay, I probably another 5 or 6 minutes because I've got a thing to do. Well, I mean, I don't know. Like, okay, let's just see how it goes.
Okay. Now we can always do like a part 2 or something. So I'll see what I can. I wanted to ask one question that was really on my mind was I wanted to know more about the Power Stone, your work on the anime Power Stone, because as far as I know, it's your only job adapting an anime, and I want to know what drove you to that particular series and medium.
That's an excellent question, and my answer is disappointing. Someone asked me to do it because they knew that I loved animation and I worked on it. They had Power Stone, they had the rights, and they wanted someone to adapt it, and they didn't have a lot of time. I live in Toronto. I love animation. And so I said, okay, look, I send me everything and give me the timeline and we'll work it out. And I think the highlight for me of that was not the writing, but going into the recording studio and seeing people like Maurice Dean Wint do the voices. And I remember going in the first time and we did the thing, and he recorded the intro for the show, and it was great. And I know nothing against him. And I turned to the producer and I said, I have to totally rewrite that because his voice and what he's doing, I can make this 10 times better.
Long ago, from the land where legends are born, it is said that one strange and special night, a night shrouded in mystery, 7 sacred stones received a magical burst of energy. The stones grew so powerful that nothing could contain them. When these 7 stones are reunited, a new age of miracles and wonders will occur.
And so I rewrote stuff based on what the voice actors were doing. Obviously, you're stuck. It's a template, right? You've got people moving their lips, and so you've got to go, how many syllables is that? What is the frontal labial movement? What's going on? What's the expression? And that was where it became work. But even that was super fun. I had a great time. But I didn't choose the project, and I didn't ask to be on it. They came to me. And it was, of course, a Silver Snail customer who knew that we were bringing in a lot of animation and manga in the 80s, which was pretty early. Like, you look at a lot of stores, they didn't start carrying Japanese material for a long time. And because of the owner, and he had a friend who went to Japan. So the reason that the Silver Snail got all that animation and got all that stuff and model kits was because he had a guy who was into model kits and went to Japan. Interestingly, this is the side, we used to sell regularly hundreds of copies of a book called Sexy Robot by Hajime Soriyama. And it's an amazing thing, but it's sexy robots. It is what the title is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But we were selling a lot. And so at one point I went to do an order And I got a guy on the phone called Kevin Seymour, and we started to talk, and it was just instant bonding. It was just boom. So he said, well, like, what else are you into? I said, well, the store is different from me, but the store, robots sell. Obviously, the bestseller is Sexy Robots. And so we started talking about, the larger context of manga. And he said, okay, um, let me send you a sampler. And I said, okay, here's the thing. Send me 3 copies of everything that you think fits what I'm looking for. And so he did, and it was terrific stuff. It was terrific. And so, and 3 gave me enough to know, okay, these 3 sold out, so I'm going to order some more. And these 3 just sat on the shelf and nobody cared. So that was really fun. And he was the one who turned me on to Akira. He's like, you've got to see this book. You are going to love this book. And so I got to see it. And then I lobbied Archie Goodwin to do an Akira comic. I'm like, dude, and I gave him one of the volumes. And I just said, this is a really amazing thing. And so, that was fun. And then Frank Miller mentioned to me that there was this great manga called Lone Wolf and Cub. And I'd never heard of it. So I called up Kevin and I said, what about this? And he goes, well, it's not robots. No, I know, but a friend of mine recommended it. So send me. He said, well, it's like, I've forgotten now, but it's 14 volumes. I said, okay, send me volume 1, volume 4, and volume 5, just one of each, and I'll look at it. And of course, I just fell in love with it, and then ended up, the Silver Snail started selling Lone Wolf and Cub, and that was just before Ronin. It was about 6 months before Ronin. So we didn't sell any. I think we sold like 2 copies. And then all of a sudden Ronin hit, and boom, we were out of Lone Wolf and Cub. So yeah, it's the adventures in retailing.
Oh, of course. Now, let's see. I'll just boil it down to a couple of questions for now, but the last couple of questions. What is your favorite food? I always like to ask this of people.
I don't know. Seriously, when I was younger, I had definite foods, and now, and I would have said my dad's lasagna. That's what I would have said. And I guess these days it would be, wow. That's a really tough one. I think
3.
probably no. Well, I probably think spaghetti. I'm a big fan with tomato sauce. That's a big one that I like.
Mm-hmm.
I really like jerk chicken, and I like cooking it. So I cook jerk chicken once a week.
Ooh.
And that's I would say those are the 2 right now. But when I worked at the Silver Snail, there was a lot of pressure, and so I drank and at Coach House, so I drank a lot of coffee. So I was drinking 15 cups of coffee a day, and so that changes what food you eat, believe it or not. And so my diet in the 80s is completely different from my diet now. I used to love a ham sandwich. I don't eat ham anymore. I don't eat bread anymore. All of that's Rick Green, of course. Rick is very interested in diet. And so, when I'm exploring, I'm trying to learn new things. And I used to love red meat. I don't eat red meat other than the spaghetti sauce. I don't have red meat. So I'm mostly a chicken guy.
Yeah.
So sorry, that's a disappointing answer.
Oh,
but
no, that's great. That's great.
but what has fascinated me is that when I was young, I didn't like spice on my food. I just didn't. Even too much salt was like, no. Mm-hmm. Too much pepper, no. Now it's like, bring on the spice. And I think that's age. I think your taste buds dull a bit. And now I just love that stuff.
I like to get experimental with spices and stuff too, so you're not alone in that. Now, the last question for today is, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I do actually. So why were you drawn? What's behind you wanting to talk to people like me and Steve Schneer?
Well, it just came from like just a love of just Canadian stuff that I watched growing up. And I mean, when I was growing up, a lot of people were like, "Oh, this show sucks because XYZ," because it came like, "Oh, Canadian cartoons versus American cartoons," and things like that. But then as I got older, I realized there was a lot of great stuff that I saw growing up, and not a lot of people outside Canada really saw that, especially on a regular basis. And I had seen, like, as I got older, I watched a bunch of other stuff that I hadn't seen as a child, like various cartoons or various other shows where I'm like, "Oh wow, this is really good, this is really good." And I do that a lot on my YouTube channel, where I just talk about various shows, like Canadian stuff that I feel is underrated or doesn't have a lot of stuff people talking about it, and I just want to share that experience with people and show them where it's like, "Hey, the great talent comes from everywhere." And I have friends who are like, it's like, "Oh, my dad was an animator on like the Raccoons or something, or some other show back in the 80s." And it's like, I know all these people, and a lot of them are just like literally like down the street or a cousin of mine or things like that. And I just want to see what I can do and just share that information with people. And I think Steve really got the ball rolling for me on this as well, where he was like, "Oh yeah, I'll hook you up with this guy and that guy. I know this guy who's really cool, and you guys should speak to this guy. He's a lot cooler than me." So I just want to do what I can with what I've got and just, I guess pay it forward is the word I'm looking for, or the term. Like, do what I can.
That's great. So I have to ask you a specific question. One of my favorite Canadian pieces of animation is Reboot. Are you a Reboot guy?
I knew a lot of people who watched Reboot back in the day. I have not given it the time of day just yet, but that's something I want to watch. And when I do, I'm sure I'm gonna love it. I'm gonna talk just my head off about it in a video, I'm sure. But Reboot, definitely, I'm gonna give that a watch someday because I know it's a big deal. And yeah.
It is, for me. It's a big deal, and I never worked. Well, I did. I wrote the pilot of Anti-Gravity Room for YTV, but I really had no connection to YTV. I knew some of the producers there, and
Ajay, Fry.
I was going to say AJ was hired. That was funny too, because he was on YTV and had a fan base and people liked him.
Mm-hmm.
But we were auditioning, and he came in, and what I said is, after we winnow out who we want, the top 12, they can interview me, and I'll get a sense of what they're like from the interview. So we it was really, really interesting. And at the end of it, the one of the people that I worked with said, "So who's your pick?" And I went, "There's no discussion." I said, "It's AJ." Like, he absolutely was doing the Rick Green thing, which he could make other people raise their game and be excited about what they were talking about. And that's an invisible skill. And AJ, the fact that he came, he understood timing, he understood theatricality, an incredible, and I've been so spoiled. I mean, Rick Green was my first host. I mean, that's amazing. And then a number of hosts that I worked with at Space, AJ, of course, Teddy Wilson, Morgan Hoffman. It's crazy. And again, such talented people. And it was, what I've learned is, particularly working with Rick Green, at a point, Rick got a bit threatened by me, and because maybe I should be hosting the show or something like that. And I just said to him, because we were old friends, I said, "You don't understand what you have," right? You're unbelievably talented, and I do not have that talent. So part of my job is to make your talent shine. And I feel that way about all the hosts that I've worked on, and never wanting them to be embarrassed, never wanting them to get anything wrong factually. And I will tell you one host story. This is one of my favorites. So I won't mention the name of the host, but they were not perceived to be the brightest bulb. I totally disagreed with that. I thought this person was very smart, but smart in a different way, and certainly smart compared to me in a different way. And what I realized was other producers had worked with this person and hadn't let them do their thing. And then in TV, that happens, right? You're a producer, you just say this or say that. So we were covering Happy Feet, George Miller directed. Do you know the movie Happy Feet?
Yeah, definitely.
So we went and saw the movie at like 8:00 in the morning. And then they wanted to talk about the movie. And I went, we're not talking about the movie. We're going to go back and we're going to sit in the commissary and then we'll talk about the movie. So they just sat there. And I thought partly my trick was, I don't want them to know what I'm thinking. I want a little bit of time to be able to sort my ideas out. And then I want them to bring something to the party, which they had never done not because they hadn't, but because they weren't offered that opportunity. So we sat down and I said, okay, so what did you like most about the movie? And they talked. I said, what did you think the movie was about? And they talked. And we, talked about various things, and like this, back and forth. She went off onto some digressions and things moved around. And I thought, okay, great. Thank you very much. So I went and I wrote the questions. And the first or second question was, why did you decide to take a penguin on a hero's journey? And the host came back to me and they said, I don't understand that question. And I said, well, the phrase a hero's journey is from Joseph Campbell, from a book he wrote called Hero with a Thousand Faces. But if you've looked at George Miller's work, you know that he really knows that stuff. He knows mythology. He's actually playing with, a certain mythological structure. And she said, I'm sorry. I can't ask that question because I don't understand it and I don't know what it is. I'm like, fine. So we took it out and she was interviewing George Miller in his wonderful tie with the 3 peppers on it, the 3 red peppers. And the first question was, why, I think it was something along the lines of, you set this into Antarctica, what were, basically, it was a setting question. I can't even remember what it was about. And he said, well, it's because in the course of the story, I wanted to take this penguin on a hero's journey. And her entire face went. And she didn't even say anything. He completely realized she knows what I'm talking about. So he goes off on this huge thing. The interview is terrific. I mean, it's really, really good. And then he leaves and I escorted him because he had to do an interview at E-Talk or Bravo. And he turned to me and he said, oh my God, she's extraordinary. That question about the hero's journey was great. And I'm like, I'm not saying anything. And I dropped him off at Bravo and I came back to the edit suite and my editor was there and she looked at me and she said, who wrote these questions? I said, well, if you ask the host, they'll say they did. She said, I did. I asked the host. And they said, yeah, I wrote the questions. There's no way they wrote the questions. I went, they did. And then I explained the story. I said, look, this is And that's, for me, that was the real joy of working with editors and working with hosts is, again, collaboration. This host had a thing that I don't have. And I think I come across as way too academic, way too square, and way too that way. And the someone who can kind of bring lightness or a kind of zing or a little zest to it, like AJ, like Teddy, like Morgan. Those people, they're just super fun to work with because they are able to do something that I can't do. And I hope they respect me for what it is that I do. And in the best of teams, like on Prisoners of Gravity, everybody respected what everybody was doing. And that made for, as I said earlier, a kind of unified vision. And I would joke with people. I'd say, when I worked at Space, I'd say, well, this is very much a space type interview. And they go, what do you mean? I said, well, a Prisoners of Gravity interview is a different thing. And they're all different. And when I do interviews on stage, because I used to do a lot of interviews at the International Festival of Authors and at various conventions, I said, those are different too, because you're doing them in an audience with a group of people and they've self-selected. If I'm doing it on TV, I have no idea if those people will even know the author that I'm talking about or know the work. But if somebody's paid $20 to see Ursula K. Le Guin or Douglas Adams or Neil Gaiman give a talk and give a reading and then do a Q&A, I know that audience is self-selected. I know that I can do things in that interview that I can't do on TV or in TV.
Yeah.
Okay,
sure.
Okay, one more. I got to do one more because this actually proves my point better.
Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere.
Okay. So I was very blessed. I was asked to interview Terry Gilliam live and with an audience. And I adore Terry Gilliam. It was for a number of reasons, a very big deal for me. Rick Green, of course, is a huge Monty Python fan. The Frantics were all Monty Python fans. My wife is a huge Monty Python fan. All my friends seem to be Monty Python friends. And I'm getting to interview Terry Gilliam. I mean, that's bananas. But it was going to be a 2-hour interview. And I said, I think you have to cut that back. Like, I don't know that I can sustain that. 45 minutes is usually what I do, at a convention. So I said, I don't mind going a little over that. But if we risk losing goodwill and losing a focus, that's a long time for someone to sit his ass down and talk. So they're like, okay. So we worked it out. And I started researching Terry Gilliam. I watched every single film. So I said to my wife and my daughter, I'm going to be doing this. So if you want to watch, we can. So we watched all the Terry Gilliam films. I did a ton of research and I was interviewing him. And at one point I was going to ask about, each of these films, like almost, like give me 5 minutes on, Brazil, like do the standard thing that everybody does. And I literally in the moment realized this isn't on TV. This isn't on TV. I don't have to illustrate what I am asking or what his answer might be. Because on TV, if I talk about Monty Python, I will have a clip of Monty Python. I'll have his animation. I'll have the foot come down. And so I said to Terry, I want to talk to you about the films that didn't get made. You were asked to be the director of Harry Potter. The audience went nuts. And then I started asking about all these movies that never got made. Now, I could only do that on stage. I could never have done that on TV. It would have been compelling. It wouldn't have worked. And it was unbelievable. I had no idea. Like I thought, well, I'll ask one. And then I thought, well, no, I'll do the list because I knew because of my research. And that was that was really, I learned a lot that night because I went, oh, I get it. I've been indoctrinated a bit by how I do it for TV. And I've been so immersed in TV for so long.
Right.
And I've forgotten what you can do live. You can make it more theatrical. You can have it be fun. They can get up and leave their chair. They can act. They can, there are things you can do. I interviewed Ray Harryhausen and I used the same trick. I figured out what to do. It's been a real gift because I've cared passionately about these people. And then I get to bring out what I think is the best in their personality and in their work and in the way they think about their work. So yeah, it's an unbelievable gift from my point of view.
I would say so too. Yeah, definitely.
Well, and you want these people to be well represented, and at my absolute best, when I am really cooking, I'm invisible. I am like the soundtrack of a great movie. No one mentions it. No one notices. The only time people tend to notice is when you've got, and but it's the more invisible I can make it, the more that they are focused on my subject, the more that I can move the spotlight to them, the better. And that's my personality. So that works out really well for me.
I feel the same way when I edit video, because I also do a lot of video editing and things like that, where I don't want people, it's sort of like what you were saying, where it's like, if people will only realize that something is wrong when I screw up somewhere or something like that, but I just want the thing to speak for itself or just add something to it. Like I've gotten comments from like people who know I'm an editor, and they said your editing style added a lot of stuff to what could have been a very dry academic video. And I was like, that's so great. That's what I want to do with stuff that I do like that. So yeah.
We got to work with some great editors, but I will say I never got to meet Thelma Schumacher, who worked with Scorsese, but I did get to spend some really good quality time with my all-time favorite editor. You want to guess who my favorite editor is?
I mean, I don't even know where to start. You might just have to tell me. You know more about this stuff than I do.
Walter Murch.
Walter Murch. Yeah, see, I don't know who that is, but...
Perfect. Then Google Walter Murch. And that was probably, after his presentation, we were hanging out at a party, and there was a real connection. And his work, and you'll see why, he's very much our thing. He's very much about storytelling. But the hint that I'll give you is of many of his editing jobs, he edited the first Godfather movie.
My goodness.
He is the guy who makes the scene where Michael discovers the gun and then kills the two guys in the restaurant. And he described what was needed in that scene and why there's no music in that scene. And he knew the scene didn't work without music. So what was he going to do or to add to make that work? And he's brilliant on sound. He's brilliant on story. And he clearly reads a lot and is interested in philosophy and storytelling. And I wish that I could go back. Well, no, not wishing I go. I wish that in the future I could interview Walter Murch again, because the more I've thought about what we talked about, the more I've thought there's a guy, and there's a book of his you can read called The Blink of an Eye, and I highly recommend that. And that's where I got a lot of my stuff, in my research.
Yeah.
And then he later did a book with Michael Ondaatje about editing, but that wasn't out when I knew him, when I got together with him. But he was in Toronto. He was in town for K-19. That movie.
Very good stuff. Like, this has been so interesting. Like, again, to bring back Steve, you are like one of the most interesting people that I have. Like, wow, look at this guy, and he's so humble, and he's just in behind the scenes everywhere. But it's just been so cool to get to know you and just speak with you. It's been amazing. I just love the passion you have for everything that you do.
Thank you. I feel it all a little bit uncomfortable because I always feel that I'm part of a team, and it is always a little bit weird to kind of be a focus, and I'd rather not be. But what are you going to do? In this case, you wanted to do a podcast, and I was available, so I'm more than happy. And you can edit. Hopefully you can get a good 10 minutes out of this.
I'll see what I can do.
See if you can save it in the edit, as they always say. I was just going to say one quick. In my career, what always pissed me off is the best stuff always came off camera or when we weren't on stage. Right? Like, just, it's crazy. And partly it's because a lot of the people who create are introverts. So they're not able to be at a certain level when they're on camera or when they're on stage. Neil Stevenson is one of my favorite writers. Terrible interview. Terrible. I interviewed him, and I went for a walk afterwards and cried because it was such a terrible interview. I didn't even think that I had anything there that I could use. I ended up covering it up with footage from NASA, and everybody liked it. But I was like, he's one of the best writers in the world, and I couldn't capture that. I couldn't get that thing. This is what, you're young, you're 30. When I was 30, I hadn't even started Prisoners of Gravity. I was just leaving the Silver Snail. So, you've got a lot, and just from my perspective, and I don't mean this as an insult.
Yeah.
But you've got a lot to learn, and I had a lot to learn, and I'm still learning.
Mm-hmm.
And if you keep that focus of curiosity, which you have, and ongoing learning, which it seems like you have, then magic will happen. It just will.
Yeah, and I never want to stop learning.
That I was okay as a student, but then I went to U of T, and I was being interviewed. I don't know, Rick Green and I were getting a big award, and the woman on the red carpet asked me a question, and I said, the great thing about university was I learned how to learn, and I could tell she didn't get it. Because unless you've really learned and been exposed to stuff that is really new, I don't think you have the thing where my brain just craves new. And I've been thinking about that lately, listening to music, partly spun on Bad Bunny, because I was listening to it. And of course, I don't know his music. I don't speak Spanish, but my brain was going, oh, I want to learn about that. Oh, why the telephone poles? Oh, what's going on with this? And because he crafted it so brilliantly, he was making my brain go, what's this story? Why is somebody getting married? those, I mean, I can't stop it
Mm-hmm.
now, because if you train yourself to want to learn, if you're curious, then things will happen, right? It's crazy to me. My friends, the women that have been my girlfriends, my amazing wife, my daughter, my community. I'm in awe of these people. I just am. And they have, I'm lucky. I've been allowed in my life to do what I love. And what I love is to learn and be curious. And I'm very lucky that because certain people saw my curiosity and saw my work ethic, that created an opportunity for me to work with them or for them. And, and for me, all starts, way back when I was a teenager. So, but doesn't catalyze.
Yeah.
I didn't really take off until I was in 32, maybe 31, 32. Yeah, 32, 1988.
Yeah. I could have figured it out, but I wanted you to do it. I was like,
I had to.
I already know too much about you. So far.
No, but it's, and that's something actually. If you're ever interviewing somebody,
yeah,
one of the key questions that you can always ask when things aren't going well, I always say, "So what do you think was the turning point in your career?" And what's interesting about that question is they can dispute it. Well, I never had a turning point. I've always been interested in downhill skiing. I've been downhill skiing since I was 4, and now I'm the world champion. So I've never wavered. Well, that's a great answer. That's great. And I don't look like an idiot for asking it, right? So I don't look like a fool, and they don't look foolish. So you're like, oh. And then you ask the same question to, a musician or, a writer or something, and they normally will be able to tell you, well, what was the turning point in your career? Well, I've had 3. I had it when I married Ursula K. Le Guin. I had it and you're like, okay, interesting. But it's a great, put that in your pocket, because if you ever have an interview that goes bad, and you will, people look at me, I go, thousands and thousands of interviews. Of course, I have my share of real duds, but there are ways to get out of it. And that's a question that usually works.
Hey everybody, this is post-interview Malik here. Now, if you can believe it, Mark had even more to share. The first part was for my ears only, but with Mark's permission, he talks about interviewing the king of comics himself, Jack Kirby, in the twilight of his life. He's talked about the experience in the past, which I'll link below, but long story short, Kirby wasn't known for giving great interviews, but convinced by fellow comic legend Frank Miller, Mark took the chance anyway. And against all odds, the interview was a rousing, emotional success. And now, Mark's gonna explain the aftermath.
We're all crying. They were all crying. And I was kind of because if you're in it, you're at the center of the storm, so you don't feel it in the same way. And so I was like, well, how was that? And they're like, it was great, man. It was great. So anyway, get back to Toronto. I can't wait to see the interview. Like, I can't wait. Because I had a feeling that it wasn't as good as I thought. I thought, they all think it's great. I think it's good. And I think he comes across well. So I put the tape in the machine, and all of a sudden, barely make him out. There's Jack Kirby is talking and can't really see. Oh my God, there's no audio. The audio, it's like the sound guy had completely fucked up. Like, what? So again, this is me and Jack Kirby. I burst into tears. I'm like, this is unbelievable. I worked so hard on this, and this guy technically screwed me. So I talked to one of the editors. I said, look, I've got this tape, and can you watch it? Can you tell me if you can fix it? So I put it in, and he's watching the meters. And of course, the meters are doing this when they should be doing this. And I said, oh my God, like, this is heartbreaking. All the other interviews seemed fine, but this one in particular, it's not working. And the editor said, you know what? Take this to Michael Jackson, not the
Not that.
famous Michael Jackson.
The other Michael Jackson.
The other Michael Jackson, who was a sound engineer and a sound guy in our building. He was an editor, but everybody knew he was a brilliant sound guy. And he had, you're so young, you won't remember this. There's a very famous Olympic moment when Greg Louganis is on the diving board and he does his dive and he hits his head on the diving board.
Yeah, I've heard
about
that.
And it makes a thunk. Yeah, it's famous. Michael Jackson was the audio guy who decided to put the mic underneath the diving board. So this is how smart this guy is. This is like super smart. So I showed him the tape and he goes, you know, I honestly don't think that I can rescue this. Now, remember, this is 93. So this is not Michael Jackson this isn't Peter Jackson in his suite of AI and being able to figure things out. Like, this is dead.
Yeah.
So he said, give it to me and I'll give me 2 months and I'll see if I can rescue it. I'm like, well, thank you, Michael. I went back up and I said, the Jack Kirby show, we're going to move it. We're going to move it back in the schedule because I probably don't have a show. And I certainly don't have one in the next 6 to 8 weeks. But anyway, a few weeks later, maybe a little over a month, Michael Jackson comes to see me in my office. And he said, I'm not entirely happy with it, but I think it's usable. And I'm like, okay. And I watched it and I just looked at him and I went, this is fantastic. Like, how did you do this? He goes, it took a lot of time. And he said, you know, and I love it when people do this. He goes, you know, I have a real job. And so I could only do this in my spare time. I said, I thank you so much. And we didn't bill him or anything. I said, you know, can I get you, you know, do you have a favorite bottle of wine? Do you have a favorite? He was like, no. I got to listen to Jack Kirby about 10 times. I'm like, oh, okay.
Ben Grimm, the Thing, he was kind of the gruff rebel, or what was he exactly?
Well, the Thing was really myself. If you'll notice the way the Thing talks and acts, you'll find that the Thing is really Jack Kirby. He has my manner of speech, and he thinks the way I do. He's excitable. You'll find that he's very, very active among people, and he can muscle his way through a crowd. And I find that I'm that sort of person.
So anyway, you think that's sort of the end of the story, except we put the show together and it has a number of great things in it. And Rick Green just loved that show. We're putting it together. The editor, Brian Karn, is like, I need more images. I need more of this. I need more of that. Marvel are being great, and they're letting me use the images. DC weren't, for whatever reason, great. They were okay, but not like Watchmen, which is whatever you want to shoot, go ahead and shoot. So anyway, finish the show, watch the show in the edit bay, and Brian and Greg are like, that is a great show. And I don't know. It didn't, I'm like, it's okay. It's okay. It, you know, it's fine. And yeah, it's, I don't know. Anyway, I realize now that what I was reacting to was how hard it had been to get everything to that point and make a show. Anyway, packaged the show, sent it off to Jack Kirby. Everything is fine. So I'm in the office on Boxing Day with Rick Green, because welcome to television. You work all the time. And I'm there, and the phone rings, and it's Roz Kirby. And she says, I can't believe it. I want to thank you for the tape. We've watched it about 20 times. The grandkids love it. They keep rewinding it. They're watching it again and again. And she said, I've got somebody on the phone for you. And it's Jack Kirby. And he says, you're good men. And I burst into tears. I just wept. And then she got back on the phone. She said, thank you very much. I hung up. And Rick Green looked at me and he goes, who died? Who died? I said, and then I told him the story. I said, Jack Kirby just said, you're good men. And Rick Green and I sat in my office crying. It was wild. And I don't know why it had such an emotional impact on us, but
That's
it did.
So cool.
So, well, then he dies in, a few months later. So almost immediately, but the show was done. So I got in touch with the programmers that I, at TVO. And I said, look, I know this is our normal, we would normally have a new episode for you, but I want this episode to run, basically once we found out that Jack had died. So we did, it was great. And then I went, oh, you know what? I'm going to call the New York Times and the New Yorker and all the big, like ABC, NBC. And I'm say to them, I have a tape with Jack Kirby. You can use whatever you want as long as you credit TVO, and you can use this. They all turned me down. The New York Times wouldn't even do a paper obit on Jack Kirby. And the New Yorker were like, oh, we will be doing something. I'm like, okay. So it turns out Art Spiegelman talked his wife, Françoise Mouly, into doing something. I think Gary Panter did something about Jack Kirby. So, yay. Talk to Frank. Jesus, Frank, I called the New York Times and they won't do an obituary on Jack Kirby. And Frank got mad, and I love mad Frank. And he said, I'm calling the New York Times. Jack Kirby got his obituary in the New York Times, thanks to Frank Miller.
Mm-hmm.
But that was, and that taught me something. As big a deal as Jack Kirby was in our community, the mainstream did not know about him. And even the guy at New York Times said, if this were Stan Lee, he would get an obituary. And I'm like, that's the nightmare. I said, it's got to be Jack. Of course you're going to give Stan one. But Jack is just as important or more important.
Mm-hmm.
And but anyway, so Jack gets his obituary. But that's how weird the world can be. From great disappointment to great joy to great disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
You
Just
never know how things are going to work. And you never know how things are going to work out. At the end of POG, I thought, well, this is it. I can go back to writing comics. I'll never work in television again. And then I became the showrunner on a show called Imprint. Mm-hmm. And I did that for 2 years, and that was toxic. And at the end of that, I went, I'm never working in TV. But it was 1996, and the comic book industry had collapsed. So you couldn't get a job at Marvel or DC in that period. And you sure as hell couldn't get one from the indies unless you were already established. So it was devastating for me. I'm like, my safety net has always been able to go back to comics. Mm-hmm. And now I can't go because that door is closed. And then space, which is the great, which is, so, you never, and that's the other thing I'd say to you. You never know what the thing is going to be.
And we went on for a little while longer, but to close out in style, a little word of advice from Mark that really stuck out to me.
The life of a creative person, particularly in Canada,